is political debate, not only in those protests, but really also about those protests. And let's look a little at that. In joining us in studio is Daniel Sheck, I should say Ambassador Daniel Sheck, former head of the European Department in the Foreign Ministry and the former Israeli ambassador to France. And joining us now from Jerusalem is Mark Zell, Vice President of Republicans Overseas and co-chair of Republican Overseas Israel. And it's interesting, Mark, we've talked a lot in recent years how sometimes events in Israel, political events, seem to be running parallel to events in the United States, maybe a little bit involved with protests too, because certainly Republicans and the supporters of the administration in the U.S. believe those demonstrations in the U.S. have gone too far. They've gone over a line. They've gone beyond legitimate dissent. What about here in Israel? How do you feel about that? Does that apply, do you feel, to Israel?
Well, I hope not. What's going on in the United States is just the other side of insanity. But here in Israel, there is a lot of frustration, and I must say that I share that frustration with how the authorities have dealt with the coronavirus, both in the first wave and now in the second, and that frustration is spilling over and is being expressed in these demonstrations. The other thing I have to say, though, there are people, and this is true in the United States, and it's also true here, sadly, who are attempting to exploit the public frustration, legitimate expression of frustration, in order to achieve political upheaval. And that's something I do not approve, whether it's in the United States or here.
I just want to clarify, by political upheaval, you mean the resignation of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and you see that in some ways as being not legitimate.
There are forces at work that are trying to basically undo the last round of elections here. And that's not a legitimate, in my view, that's not a legitimate basis for these demonstrations. But it is legitimate, in my view, for the people to express their dissatisfaction with the manner in which the government has been dealing with this crisis, this health crisis. That is something that needs to be fixed. There are attempts to do that. I hope that they work.
Right. Danny, how do you react to sort of drawing the line here, saying it's legitimate to protest about the government's handling of the coronavirus, but calling on Prime Minister Netanyahu to resign, that's just trying to undo the democratic process at the ballot box?
Well, I'll just say a word about that, because that is not entirely true. I do have to remind you that there were 3 election rounds in the last 14 months. In none of them did Prime Minister Netanyahu have a majority. So, and if he was able to form a government in the third time around, it was because another party, Blue-White, took hundreds of thousands of votes who voted against Netanyahu and joined that government. So that only fueled the frustration of those people who have a feeling that even the political tools of democracy are not working anymore in a satisfactory manner to them. Beyond that, I completely agree that the main fuel to these protests, and I believe that this is just the beginning, that they're going to grow and grow and grow, is frustration. And that underlying frustration has been around for a long time, for several years already. But it took the sense of helplessness because of the coronavirus and because of the handling of the crisis economically and medically by the government to sort of help this frustration erupt and find a channel into what are by and large peaceful protests. Pierre Clochendler just said there's a lot of folklore there. People are angry, but they try to channel their anger into something that is beautiful, fraternal. There are people from all sorts of walks of life in Israel. It's not organized.
Right.
There is no hierarchy that commands these things. They don't. I'm not even sure they know exactly what their end game is. What do they want? They want to express their disappointment and their frustration, and they want to put pressure on the prime minister. That is absolutely
right. I do have to say there is a sort of core there that is demanding that the prime minister step down.
Yes, but I'm saying they're not.
But not every. It's not just that.
They don't cover everybody.
Mark, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Danny said, also including his point that a lot of these protesters feel the democratic system failed them in the last election and what occurred after the last election. And when that happens, people have the right to protest, to go out in the streets.
Well, look, people in a democracy have the right to protest, and I've said that. It's when these protests become the tools of other forces that are trying to achieve political power through a means other than through the democratic process. The way you change governments in a democracy is through elections, not through revolution. Now, what's happening in the United States, though, is quite different. And the ambassador said something about the protests in Israel not being organized and being spontaneous and fraternal. I don't know. Maybe that's true and maybe it's not. But in the United States, it's definitely not true. And what's going on there has nothing to do with George Floyd or Black Lives Matter. It has to do with changing the powers through violence.
Let's keep it in Israel. I just want to just point, in a parliamentary democracy, you don't need new elections. A prime minister can be replaced or be forced to resign without elections.
Okay, fair enough. And we're coming up to a threshold issue at the end of August, when the budget has to be approved. And if it's not, I think we're going back to elections unless a new coalition forms. This is the way politics is done in Israel. I think we have an electoral system here that is broken. I think a lot of people feel that, and we need a change. But it's not going to, and maybe these protests will be a catalyst for change through the proper processes. I wouldn't be opposed to that. But I think we need to be careful that Israel doesn't follow the example of the United States and let these demonstrations turn into something other than a genuine expression of public disfavor.
Well, what about that then? Do you agree with that in terms of, like, there is a point in which they shouldn't go beyond, and do you share Mark's view about those demonstrations in the U.S.?
You know, I don't know what that point is. To me, the threshold, the problematic threshold, is mainly violence. And there has been no violence from these protesters. You mentioned that there was violence in your introduction, but honestly, it didn't come from demonstrators who supported Netanyahu. It came from thugs who are maybe right-wing, but who infiltrated the protests in order to get into trouble. And they came with bottles, and they came with knives, and there are people injured, and there is a real concern about the security. I can tell you, there was an initiative yesterday by a private person to ask people to help with donations for security for the demonstrators. She's a private person. She has a large following on Twitter. Within 3 hours, 600 people donated small sums of money, and there are tens of thousands of shekels who will now go to finding some kind of system of security, internal or external. So there is a real concern. And, I have to go back to that it's diffuse. I have sons the age of the demonstrators. Some of them participate. I talk to them. I talk to their friends. I can assure you they don't belong to any organization, and they certainly don't take any instructions from anybody. They just feel that they have to express the feelings they have about the system, about the fact that they are governed for many years by a prime minister who is under 3 serious indictments, who is trying to undermine the judicial system, the Knesset.
I want to give Mark a chance to respond.
Exactly what I'm complaining about.
Go ahead,
He's
Mark.
doing it. This is political exploitation.
Of course it's political. There's no exploitation. That's what they're angry about.
He started on the blue and white left-wing line. And a lot of the people you've heard on the interviews from the demonstration admit that they are hard left supporters.
So what's wrong with that? So what's wrong with that?
I tell you what's wrong with it. What's wrong with it is that you've got an electoral process for picking the government. And when you start to go into the streets and overturn it by revolution...
You don't overturn it. There's no revolution here. There is pressure on the Prime Minister to resign.
All right. You think what's going on in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle is okay?
No, I don't know. I don't know anything about the United States. I don't know anything.
Let's keep it in
to comment on that. We have a very different system. We have a very different political system. Very different.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, clearly I don't expect you to agree on certainly the outcome of these demonstrations. But again, as we said, it is a democracy, and people can express their views at the ballot box, certainly, Mark, as they do, and also in demonstrating in the streets, as they also do. Mark Sell, coming from Jerusalem, thank you for that. Daniel Sheck,
thank you.
Thank you for joining us.